So we're picking up where the dwarves have just finished singing. So as they sang the... Whoa! I'm off today. Here we go. As they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him. A fierce and a jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something tookish woke up inside of him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out of the window. The stars were out in a dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarves shining in dark caverns. Suddenly in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably somebody lighting a wood fire, and he thought of plundering dragons settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins of Bag End, under hill again. He got up trembling. He had less than half a mind to fetch the lamp and more than half a mind to pretend to go and hide behind the beer barrels in the cellar and not come out again until all the dwarves had gone away. Suddenly he found that the music and the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin in a tone that seemed to show that he guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. "What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said all the dwarves. "Dark for dark business. There are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool and sat in the fender, knocking over the poker and shovel with a crash. "Hush," said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began. Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, this most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out. All praise to his wine and ale. He paused for breath and for a polite remark from the hobbit, but the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo Baggins, who was wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious, and worst of all, fellow conspirator. Though no noise came out, he was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on. "We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, means, policy, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start on our long journey. A journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and counselor, the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return." Ingenious. Lord, can you tell that my 11-month-old kept me up for 4 hours last night? Lord almighty. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to us all. To the estimable Mr. Baggins, and perhaps to one or two of the younger dwarves, I think I should be right in naming Keely and Philly, for instance, the exact situation at the moment may require a little brief explanation. This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. It had been allowed. He would have probably have gone on like this until he was out of breath without telling anyone anything that was not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At "may never return," he began to feel a shriek coming up inside, and very soon it burst out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarves sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in its firework glare the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearthrug, shaking like a jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept on calling out, struck by lightning, over and over again. And that was all they could get out of him for a long time. So they took him and laid him out of the way on one of the drawing room sofas with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business. "Excitable little fellow," said Gandalf as they sat down again. "Gets funny queer fits, but he is one of the best, as fierce as a dragon in a pinch." If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize that this was only poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to old Tuke's great-granduncle Bullroarer, who was so huge, for a hobbit, that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham in the Battle of the Greenfields, and knocked their king Golfimble's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole, and in this way the battle was won, and the game of golf invented at the same moment. In the meanwhile, however, Bullroarer's gentler descendant was reviving on the drawing room. After a while and a drink, he crept nervously to the door of the parlor. This is what he heard. Gloin speaking. Will he do you think? It is all very well for Gandalf to talk about this hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that in a moment of excitement would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives, and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I should have been sure we had come to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts. He looks more like a grocer than a burglar. Then Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The Took side had won. He suddenly felt he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. As for little fellow bobbing on the mat, it almost made him really fierce. Many a time afterwards, the Baggins part regretted what he did now, and he said to himself, Bilbo, you were a fool. You walked right in and put your foot in it. Pardon me, he said. If I have overheard words that you were saying, I don't pretend to understand what you are talking about or your reference to burglars, but I think I am right in believing that you think I am no good. I will show you. I have no signs on my door. It was painted a week ago. And I'm quite sure you have come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces on the doorstep, I had my doubts. But treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done and I will try it. If I have to walk from here to the east of East and fight the wild wereworms in the last desert. I had a great-great-great-granduncle once, Bullroarer Took, and... Yes, but that was long ago, said Gloin. I was talking about you. And I assure you there is a mark on this door, the usual one in the trade, or used to be. Burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement, and reasonable reward. That's how it is usually read. You can say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do, it's all the same to us. Gandalf told us that there was a man of this sort in these parts looking for a job at once, and that he had arranged for a meeting here this Wednesday tea time. Of course there is a mark, said Gandalf. I put it there myself, for very good reasons. You asked me to find the 14th man for your expedition, and I chose Mr. Baggins. Just let anyone say I chose the wrong man or the wrong house, and you can stop at 13 and have all the bad luck you like, or go back to digging coal. He scowled so angrily at Gloin that the dwarf huddled back in his chair, and when Bilbo tried to open his mouth to ask a question, he turned and frowned at him and stuck out his bushy eyebrows, until Bilbo shut his mouth tight with a snap. That's right, said Gandalf. Let's have no more argument. I have chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you. If I say he is a burglar he is, or will be when the time comes. There's a lot more in him than you can guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. You may, possibly, all live to thank me yet. Now, Bilbo, my boy, fetch the lamp, and let's have a little light on this. On the table in the light of a big lamp with a red shade, he spread a piece of parchment rather like a map. This was made by Thror, your grandfather, Thorin, he said in answer to the dwarf's excited questions. It is a plan of the mountain. I don't see that this will help us much, said Thorin disappointedly after a glance. I remember the mountain well enough and the lands about it, and I know where Mirkwood is, and the withered heath where the great dragons bred. There is a dragon marked in red on the mountain, said Balin, but it'll be easy enough to find him without that if ever we arrive there. There is one point that you haven't noticed, said the wizard, and that is the secret entrance. You see the rune on the west side and the hand pointing to it from the other runes. That marks a hidden passage to the lower halls. It may have been secret once, said Thorin, but how do we know that it is secret any longer? Old Smaug has lived there long enough now to find out anything there is to know about those caves. Sip of coffee. He may, but he can't have used it for years and years. Why? Because it is too small. 5 feet high the door, and 3 may walk abreast, say the runes, but Smaug could not creep into a hole that size. Not even when he was a young dragon, certainly not after devouring so many of the dwarves and men of Dale. It seems a great big hole to me, squeaked Bilbo, who had no experience of dragons and only of hobbit holes. He was getting excited and interested again so that he had forgot to keep his mouth shut. He loved maps, and in his hall there hung a large one of the country round with all his favorite walks marked on it in red ink. How could such a large door be kept secret from everybody outside apart from the dragon, he asked. He was only a little hobbit, you must remember. In lots of ways, said Gandalf, but in what way this one has been hidden we don't know without going to see. From what it says on the map, I should guess there is a closed door which has been made to look exactly like the side of the mountain. That is the usual dwarves' method. I think that is right, isn't it? Quite right, said Thorin. Also, went on Gandalf, I forgot to mention that with the map went a key, a small and curious key. Here it is. He said and handed to Thorin a key with a long barrel and intricate wards made of silver. Keep it safe. Indeed I will, said Thorin, and he fastened it upon his fine chain that hung about his neck and under his jacket. Now things begin to look more hopeful. This news alters them much for the better. So far we have had no clear idea of what to do. We thought of going east as quiet and careful as we could as far as the Long Lake. After that, the trouble would begin. A long time before that, if I know anything about the roads east, interrupted Gandalf. We might go from there up along the river running, went on Thorin, making no notice, and so to the ruins of Dale, the old town in the valley there under the shadow of the mountain. But we, none of us, liked the idea of the front gate. The river runs right out of it through the great cliff at the side of the mountain, and out of it comes the dragon too. Far too often, unless he has changed his habits. That would be no good, said the wizard, not without a mighty warrior, even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands, and in the neighborhood heroes are scarce, or simply not to be found. Swords in these parts are mostly blunt, and axes are used for trees, and shields as cradles or dish covers, and dragons are comfortably far off, and therefore legendary. That is why I settled on burglary, especially when I remembered the existence of a side door, and here is our little Bilbo Baggins, the burglar, the chosen and selected burglar. So now let's get on and make some plans. Very well then, said Thorin. Supposing the burglar expert gives us some ideas or suggestions. He turned with mock politeness to Bilbo. First, I should like to know a bit more about things, said he, feeling all confused and a bit shaky inside, but so far still tookishly determined to go on with things. I mean about the gold and the dragon and all that, and how it got there and who it belongs to and so on and further. Bless me, said Thorin. Haven't you got a map and didn't you hear our song? And haven't we been talking about all of this for hours? All the time I should like it all plain and clear, said he, putting on his business manner, usually reserved for people who try to borrow money off him, and doing his best to appear wise and prudent and professional and live up to Gandalf's recommendation. Also, I should like to know about risks, out-of-pocket expenses, time required, and remuneration and so forth, by which he meant, what am I going to get out of it, and am I going to come back alive? Oh, very well, said Thorin. Long ago in my grandfather Thror's time, our family was driven out of the far north, and came back with all their wealth and their tools to this mountain on the map. It had been discovered by my Fard ancestor Thrain the Old, but now they mined and they tunneled and they made huger halls and greater workshops, and in addition I believe they found a good deal of gold and great many jewels too. Anyway, they grew immensely rich and famous, and my grandfather was king under the mountain again, and treated with great reverence by the mortal men who lived to the south, and were gradually spreading up the running river as far as the valley overshadowed by the mountain. They built the merry town of Dale there in those days. Kings used to send for our smiths and reward even the least skillful most richly. Fathers would beg us to take their sons as apprentices and pay us handsomely, especially in food supplies, which we never bothered to grow or find for ourselves. Altogether, those were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend and to lend, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it. Not to speak of the most marvelous and magical toys, the likes of which is not to be found in the world nowadays. So my grandfather's halls became full of armor and jewels and carvings and cups, and the toy market of Dale was the wonder of the north. Unfortunately, that was what brought the dragon. Dragons steal gold and jewels. You know, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them. And they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, and they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor. There were lots of dragons in the north in those days, and gold was probably getting scarce up there, with the dwarves flying south or getting killed and all the general waste and destruction that dragons make going from bad to worse. There was a most especially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smaug. One day he flew up into the air and came south. The first we heard of it was a noise like a hurricane coming from the north, and the pine trees on the mountain creaking and cracking in the wind. Some of the dwarves who happened to be outside, I was one luckily, a fine adventurous lad in those days, always wandering about, and it saved my life that day. Well, from a good way off we saw the dragon settle on our mountain in a spout of flame. Then he came down the slopes, and when he reached the woods they all went up in fire. By that time all the bells were ringing in Dale and the warriors were arming. The dwarves rushed out of their great gate, but there was the dragon waiting for them. None escaped that way. The river rushed up in a steam and a fog fell on Dale, and in the fog the dragon came on them and destroyed most of the warriors, the usual unhappy story. It was only too common in those days. Then he went back and crept in through the front gate and routed all the halls, lanes and tunnels, alleys, cellars, mansions and passages. After that there were no dwarves left alive. And here is the first illustration we have of Hobbiton and Baggin. Here, I'll actually make it bigger for you. The hill and Hobbiton across the water. I don't know why it won't focus. That's okay. I know, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Shouldn't be the background blurred. I think the camera's just having trouble focusing on the book, but that is what he had hand-drawn himself. Oh wait, maybe if I... There you go. That's a little bit better anyway. Get back to the book club one. It is very cozy. Also, I am wearing a shirt today for a nonprofit called For the Deaf Girl, run by a friend of ours. We did a charity stream. If you guys could give them a follow on Instagram, that would be awesome. And then Smaug took all their wealth for himself, probably for that is the dragon's way. He has piled it all up in a great heap far inside and sleeps on it for a bed. Later he used to crawl out of the great gate and come by night to Dale and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale was ruined, and all the people dead or gone. What goes on there now, I don't know for certain, but I don't suppose anyone lives nearer to the mountain than the far edge of the long lake nowadays. The few of us that were well outside sat and wept in hiding and cursed Smaug, and there were unexpectedly joined by my father and my grandfather with singed beards. They looked very grim, but they said very little. When I asked how they had got away, they told me to hold my tongue, said that one day in the proper time I should know. After that we went away, and we have had to earn our livings as best we could up and down the lands, often enough sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we have never forgotten our stolen treasure, and even now, when I will allow we have a good bit laid by and are not so badly off. Here Thorn stroked the gold chain around his neck. We still mean to get it back and to bring our curses home to Smaug, if we can. I have often wondered about my father and my grandfather's escape. I see now they must have had a private side door which only they knew about, but apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got a hold of it, and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir. I did not get hold of it, I was given it, said the wizard. Your grandfather Thror was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Azog the Goblin. Curse his name, yes, said Thorin. And Thrain, your father, went away on the 21st of April 100 years ago last Thursday and has never been seen by you since. True, true, said Thorin. Well, your father gave this to me to give to you, and if I had chosen my own time and way for handling it over. You can hardly blame me, considering the trouble I had to find you. Your father could not remember his own name when he gave me the paper, and he never told me yours. So on the whole, I think I ought to be praised and thanked. Here it is, said he, handing the map to Thorin. I don't understand, said Thorin, and Bilbo felt he would have liked to say the name. The explanation did not seem to explain. Your grandfather, said the wizard slowly and grimly, gave the map to his son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventures of a most unpleasant sort he had, but he never got near the mountain. How he got there, I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the Necromancer. Whatever were you doing there? Asked Thorin with a shudder, and all the dwarves shivered. Never you mind. I was finding things out, as usual, and a nasty, dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering and had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key. We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria, said Thorin. We must give thought to the Necromancer. Do not be absurd. He is an enemy far beyond the powers of all the dwarves put together. If they could all be collected again from the four corners of the world, the one thing your father wished for was for his son to read the map and use the key. The dragon and the mountain are more than big enough tasks for you. Hear, hear, said Bilbo, and accidentally said it aloud. Hear what? They all said, turning suddenly towards him. And he was so flustered that he answered, Hear what I have got to say. What's that? They asked. Well, I should say that you ought to go east and have a look around. After all, there is the side door, and dragons must sleep sometimes, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you will think of something. And well, don't you know, I think we have talked long enough for one night, if you see what I mean. What about bed and an early start and all that? I will give you a good breakfast before you go. Before we go, I suppose you mean, said Thorin. Aren't you the burglar? And isn't sitting on the doorstep your job, not to speak of getting inside the door? But I agree about bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with my ham when starting on a journey, fried, not poached, and mind you, don't break them. After all the others had ordered their breakfast without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much, they all got up. The Hobbit had to find room for them all, and filled all his spare rooms and made beds on chairs and sofas before he got them all stowed and went on to his own little bed, very tired and not altogether happy. One thing he did make his mind up about was not to bother to get up very clearly and cook everyone else's wretched breakfast. Right? 6 fried eggs and ham? What in the heck? I can't eat more than like 2 eggs without getting even remotely sick. That's a wild order. I'm not gonna lie. That's crazy. And as he lay in bed, he could hear Thorin still humming to himself in the best bedroom next to him. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away, ere break of day, to find our long-forgotten gold. Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he woke up. And that's Chapter 1. How do we feel? How do we feel so far? Chapter 1, like I said, I've read The Hobbit probably 7 or 8 times. And I thought for a first book club experience, this would be a great way to start. Just because the book is so fun. We could even go through The Lord of the Rings as a whole afterwards, but let's get cracking on Chapter 2 here. You never read it before at all? Dude, hold up. Here, we'll have a quick conversation while I have a little more coffee, because if I drink this any later, I'm gonna be up all night. And the baby already kept me up all night one night. I'm trying to go the frick to sleep, dude. I'm trying to sleep tonight. Do you hear that? I smacked the cup in my teeth. Oh. Well, like I said, and one of the main reasons I want to do this is I want to have any books that I've read or enjoyed reading or plan on reading to my son as he gets a little bit older. I want to have recordings of them as well. So there's stuff for my grandkids or things like that. I don't know. I like to think about those things, and I think it's a lot of fun. It is an easy read. It is a way easier read. The Lord of the Rings is nowhere near as simple. The Hobbit was written specifically as a children's book. So it isn't as chock full of lore or filled with references that you wouldn't be able to understand, needing to reference like the Silmarillion or any other of the books like Numenor. Everything is entitled to this one book. And this was written first. So The Hobbit was written and then The Lord of the Rings came after. So that whole bit about the necromancer is actually talking about Sauron. So the necromancer is Sauron. And I know that the Hobbit movies aren't super great. I love them personally. But in the extended editions, Peter Jackson uses the Silmarillion and the references to the necromancer in here, which is the only reference to the necromancer at all in this book. I believe there might be one more, but that's the only reference I believe in the whole book to talk about the necromancer. So I think Peter Jackson did a good job using that reference and the Silmarillion to combine those two things. I think the extended scenes in The Hobbit are great for filling in those gaps. If you're asking me if someone were to ask me if I prefer The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, I don't think that it's something that you can really answer that simply. Specifically because of your comment, which is you're surprised how easy it is to read, because it is a drastically different reading experience for sure. I always like to tell people, if you're going to read Lord of the Rings and you haven't read The Hobbit or you haven't read the Silmarillion, it's always a great idea to have like a backup. Hold on. I've got it over here. Let me run over here and grab it. I have different ones of these. This is just the dictionary, but David Day writes these. They're all in these like nice, like, I don't know, rubber-ish books. But I always like to tell people, if you're going to read Lord of the Rings and you haven't really watched the movies, or you haven't read The Hobbit, you haven't read the Silmarillion, having these is huge. It makes a massive difference. Because any kind of question or thought that you could pull up in here, you're going to be able to find it. It has great illustrations for like the eagles. I love having this. I have different ones that David Day has written, and they're all fantastic. Now, I want to see if, actually, now that I think about it, if the necromancer is referenced in here. If you guys ever have questions, I can just pull this out and just answer whatever you might be curious about, just based off like the history of the world. Go back one more page. Nazgul. Okay, so it doesn't have anything about necromancer, probably because it is a singular reference out of God knows how many pages, but it is a lot of fun. So the Silmarillion is essentially a collected history book of all the different events leading up to Middle Earth and the Middle Age. So originally, The Lord of the Rings was written based after Tolkien had created the language for Elvish and Dwarvish. He had a huge passion for linguistics and storytelling, but the languages came before the books. There are different things he had written, like short stories, like the story of Culliver, which were like precursors to the world. That story being a very short story, maybe 40 pages, and it was kind of like an opening to the world. But the Silmarillion patches together all the histories of everything, the entire world, the creation, the fall, the events of the War of the Ring, and so forth. It is, look, if you ever want to read the Silmarillion, it is not an easy read. The Hobbit, very easy read. Lord of the Rings, it's definitely a little bit harder. The Silmarillion is not an easy read. It is quite difficult. And a lot of people I know who love reading Lord of the Rings, they don't touch the Silmarillion because it really just reads like a history book. It's just facts, 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 short, 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 just over and over again. It's nothing that is so concise, if that makes sense. So it is. Oh, and you didn't know? Yeah. So Tolkien illustrated everything, having the images in mind of what he wanted. Now, I do enjoy Tolkien's illustrations. In the next chapter, there is another one that he done. But there are versions of these books that are illustrated by Alan Lee, who did the conceptual art for the movies. And gosh, if I could get my hands on one of those copies, I just can't justify it because I own so many copies that it's like, am I really going to spend $150 on 3 more books that I own 4 copies of? You know what I mean? So it's those, if you get a chance, those illustrations are insane. 100%. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of it was kind of what they... Nope, you've never read it. I'm going to stop because I'm talking way too far ahead. But Chapter 1. Very good. We've got Chapter 2 here. Let me see how long it is. I don't remember. Yeah, let's read through Chapter 2, and then we'll call it a day. I usually try to keep these down to an hour, but I know we didn't finish Chapter 1 last time, so we're going to go a little past 7 to finish Chapter 2, and then moving forward, we'll do a chapter every Sunday at 6. So we'll start now with Chapter 2. Back to the screen, bro. Chapter 2. Roast mutton. Up jumped Bilbo and, putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room. There he saw nobody but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved after all to think that they had all gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up. But with never a thank you, he thought. And yet in a way he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself, "thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age." So he put on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time, the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the open window, when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," said he, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast or whatever you call it at 10:30. They left you a message because they could not wait." "What message?" said Mr. Baggins, all in a fluster. "Great elephant," said Gandalf, "you are not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece." "What's that got to do with it? I have had enough to do with washing up for the 14. "If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this just under the clock," said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own note paper, and this is what he read. "Thorn and Company to Burglar Bilbo. Greeting. For your hospitality and sincerest thanks, and for your offer for professional assistance, our grateful acceptance. Terms: cash on delivery up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual. We have the honor to remain yours deeply, Thorn and Company." "Now that leaves you just 10 minutes. You'll have to run," said Gandalf. "But," said Bilbo. "No time for it," said the wizard. "But," said Bilbo again, "no time for that either. Off you go." To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, a walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took when he went out. Leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more. Very puffed he was when he got to the Bywater just on the stroke of 11 and found he had come without a pocket handkerchief. "Bravo," said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggages, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo. "Up you two get, and off we go," said Thorin. "I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I have come without my hat, and I have left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note until after 10:45 to be precise." "Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry. You will have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many other things before you get to the journey's end. As for a hat, I've got a spare hood and cloak in my luggage." And that's how they all came to start jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May. On laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding very long when up came Gandalf, very splendid on a white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day. Except, of course, when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel the adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wild, respectable country inhabited by decent folk, with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands, they had been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. To think it will soon be June," grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time. It was pouring with rain, and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes. His cloak was full of water. The pony was tired and stumbled on stones, and the others were too grumpy to talk. "And I'm sure the rain had gotten into the dry clothes and into the food bags," thought Bilbo. "Bothered burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire with the kettle just beginning to sing." It was not the last time he had wished that. Still the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark as they went down into a deep valley with a river at the bottom. Wind got up and willows along its banks, bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with the rains, came rushing down the hills and mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they had crossed over. The wind broke up the grey clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper, and where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on? Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he simply was not there at all. Just when a wizard would have been the most useful to, groaned Dori and Nori, who shared the hobbits' views about regular meals, plenty and often. They decided in the end that they would have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees and thought it was drier under them. The wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip-drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gotten into the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere out of almost anything, wind or no wind. But they could not do it that night, not even Oin and Gloin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright at nothing and bolted. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, Fili and Kili were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away off with him. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper and less for breakfast. There they all sat glum, wet, and muttering, while Oin and Gloin went on trying to light the fire and quarreling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures are not at all pony rides in May sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of the trees they could now see a light shining. A reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they could go and see, and anything was better than little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all the night. Others said these parts are none too well known and are too near the mountains. Travelers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use, things have changed for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom even heard of the king around here, and the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find. Some said, "After all, there are 14 of us." Others said, "Where's Gandalf got to?" This remark was repeated by everyone. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Oin and Gloin began to fight. That settled it. "After all, we have got a burglar with us," they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could make a deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and dratting. As they went through the trees in the pitch dark, suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. "Now it is the burglar's turn," they said, meaning Bilbo. "You must go on and find out all about the light and what it is for. And if all is perfectly safe and canny," said Thorin to the Hobbit, "now scuttle off and come back quick if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can." Off Bilbo had to go before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in woods. Absolutely quietly. They take pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all the dwarvish racket as they went along. Though I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally, he got right up to the fire. For fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting around a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that, from the great heavy faces of them and their size and the shape of their legs. Not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all. At all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow," said one of the trolls, never blinking a bit of man flesh. "We would have had for long enough," said a second. "What the 'ell, William, was a-thinking to bring us into these parts? It all beats me, and the drinkin' runnin' short, and what's more," he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said as soon as he could. "You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be at by you and Bert. You've 'ad a village and a half between years since you came down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way. When you'd have said thank your Bill for a nice bit of fat valley mutton like what this is." He took a big bite off a sheep's leg he was roasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only 1 head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try roast dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a bit good of quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the troll's pockets. It is nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. Pinched the very mutton off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others more practical, but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorn and Company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pockets seemed the least difficult. So at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink, then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! Thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. "Ew, are you?" it squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round as it grabbed Bilbo by the neck before it could duck behind the tree. "Blimey, Bert, look what I've copped," said William. "What is it?" said the others, coming up. "Lummy if I knows. What are you?" "Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit," said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. "A hobbit?" said they, a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake and mighty suspicious about anything new to them. "What's a hobbit got to do with any pocket anyway?" said William. "And can you cook 'em?" said Tom. "You can try," said Bert, picking up a skewer. "He wouldn't make above a mouthful," said William, who'd already had a fine supper, not when he was skinned and boned. "Perhaps there are more like him round about, and we might make a pie," said Bert. "Here, you, are there any more of your sort sneaking in these here woods, your nasty little rabbit?" said he, looking at the hobbit's furry feet, and he picked him up by the toes and shook him. "Yes, lots," said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friends away. "No, none at all, not one," he said, immediately afterwards. "What do you mean?" said Bert, holding him right way up by the hair this time. "What I say," said Bilbo, gasping, "and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I am a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook. If you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper." "Poor little blighter," said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he had lots of beer. "Poor little blighter, let him go." "Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all," said Bert. "I don't want to have me throat cut in my sleep. Hold his toes in the fire until he talks." "I won't have it," said William. "I caught him anyway." "Well, you're a fat fool, William," said Bert, "as I've said before this evening. And you're allowed. And I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins," says Bert, and puts his fist in William's eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left, and when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet, before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with the branch to bring them back to their senses. And that, of course, only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round. So there he lay for a while, panting just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight, up came Balin. The dwarves had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and a sack Tom quick, they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. A sack was over his head and he was down. "There's more to come yet," said Tom, "or I'm mighty mistook." "Lots and none at all it is," said he. "No hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves. That's about the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert, "and we'd best get out of the light." And so they did. With sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows. as each dwarf came up and looked at the fire, and the spilled jugs and the gnawed mutton in surprise. Pop went a nasty smelly sack over his head and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Fili and Kili together, and Dori and Nori and Ori all in a heap, and Oin and Gloin and Bifur and Bofer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. That'll teach 'em, said Tom, for Bifur and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad as dwarves will when cornered. And then here is, let me get that pulled up. The way the trolls are written is really hard to read succinctly. I also need to focus. But it is Tolkien drew this. It is a picture of the dwarves walking up to the encampment fire, and off in the shadows are the trolls holding sacks. I'm trying to get it to focus. I don't know why it won't. But that is Tolkien's rendition of the scene. Thorin came at last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. Oh, interesting. Send me a picture of that. I'd be curious. Post it in the Discord. I'd like to see what the difference looks like. He stood outside in the shadows some way off and said, "What's all this trouble? Who has been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks," said he. "Oh, are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was as thick as a young tree trunk, but he was sent spinning up into the top of some bushes when Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes. And so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks with 3 angry trolls, and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squish them into jelly. And Bilbo up in a bush with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back. But no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument, they had all agreed to it. "No good roasting them now. It'd take all night," said a voice. Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William, and so the argument began all over again. In the end, they decided to mince them fine and boil them, so they got a great black pot and they took out their knives. "No good boiling them, we ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom's. "Shut up," said they, "or we'll never have done, and you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more." "Shut up yourself," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "Who's arguing but you? I'd like to know." "You're a booby," said William. "Booby yourself," said Tom. And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them and boil them next time. "Well, who shall we sit on first?" said the voice. "Better sit on the last fellow first," said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking. "Don't talk to yourself," said Tom. "But if he wants to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he?" "The one with the yellow stockings," said Bert. "Nonsense, the one with the gray stockings," said a voice like William's. "I made sure it was yellow," said Bert. "Yellow it was," said William. "Then what did you say it was gray for?" said Bert. "I never did. Tom said it." "That I never did," said Tom. "It was you." 2 to 1, so shut your mouth," said Bert. Who are you a-talking to? Said William. Now stop it, said Tom and Bert together. The night's getting on, and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it. Dawn take you all and be stoned to you, said a voice that sounded like William's, but it wasn't. For just at that moment, the light came over the hill and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood turned to stone as he stooped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds perch on them. For trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains that they are made of, and they never move again. That is what had happened to Bert and Tom and William. Excellent, said Gandalf as he stepped from behind a tree and helped Bilbo to climb down out of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling until the light came and made an end of them. The next thing was to untie the sacks and let out the dwarves. They were nearly suffocated and very annoyed, and they had not at all enjoyed lying there listening to the trolls making plans for roasting them and squashing them and mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what had happened to him twice over before they were satisfied. Silly time to go practicing pinching and pocket-picking, said Bomber. And what we wanted was fire and food. And that's just what you wouldn't have got of those fellows without a struggle in any case, said Gandalf. Anyhow, you're wasting time now. Don't you realize that the trolls must have a cave or a hole dug somewhere near here to hide from the sun? We must look into it. They searched about and soon found the marks of a troll's stony boots going away through the trees. They followed the tracks up the hill until, hidden by bushes, they came on a big door of stone leading to a cave. But they could not open it. Not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations. Would this be any good? Asked Bilbo when they were getting tired and angry. I found it on the ground where the trolls had their fight. He held out a largest key, though no doubt William had thought it very small and secret. It must have fallen out of his pocket, very luckily, before he was turned to stone. Now why on earth didn't you mention it before? They cried. Gandalf grabbed it and fitted it into the keyhole. Then the stone door swung back with one big push and they all went inside. There were bones on the floor and a nasty smell was in the air, but there was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on shelves and on the ground, among an untidy litter of plunder and all sorts from brass buttons to pots full of gold coins standing in a corner. There were lots of clothes too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls. I'm afraid that these belonged to victims, and among them were several swords of various makes, shapes, and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly because of their beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the Hobbit. These look like good blades, said the wizard, half drawing them and looking at them curiously. They were not made by any troll nor by any smith among men in these parts and days, but when we can read the runes on them, we shall know more about them. Let's get out of this horrible smell, said Feely. So they carried out the pots of coins and such food as was untouched and looked fit to eat, also one barrel of ale which was still full. By that time they felt like breakfast, and being very hungry, they did not turn their noses up at what they had gotten from the troll's larder. Their own provisions were scanty. Now they had bread and cheese and plenty of ale and bacon to toast it in the embers of the fire. After that they slept for the night and had been disturbed. And they did nothing more till the afternoon. Then they brought up their ponies and carried away the pots of gold and buried them very secretly not far from the track by the river, putting a great many spells over them just in case. When that was done, they all mounted once more and jogged along again on the path towards the east. Now where did you go to, if I may ask, said Thorin to Gandalf as they rode along. To look ahead, said he. And what brought you back in the nick of time? Looking behind, said he. Exactly, said Thorin, but could you be more plain? I went to spy out our road. It will soon become dangerous and difficult. Also, I was anxious about the replenishing our small stock of provisions. I had not gone very far, however, when I met a couple of friends of mine from Rivendell. Where's that? Asked Bilbo. Do not interrupt, said Gandalf. You will get there in a few days now, if we're lucky, and find out all about it. As I was saying, I had met two of Elrond's people. They were hurrying along for fear of the trolls. It was they that told me that the three of them had come down from the mountains and settled in the woods not far from the road. They had frightened everyone away from the district, and they waylaid the strangers. I immediately had a feeling that I was wanted back. Looking behind, I saw a fire in the distance and made for it. So now you know. Please be more careful next time, or we shall never get anywhere. Thank you, said Thorin. That's chapter 2. And we will do chapter 3 next week at 6 on Sunday.